3 mail-order brides were being auctioned like cattle in thunder. Creek's most notorious saloon, until a wealthy rancher smashed through the doors and turned the entire town upside down with a decision that would ignite a war between justice and greed in the deadliest frontier town west of the Mississippi. The autumn wind howled through Thunder Creek like a banshee's wail, carrying the scent of dust and desperation through the crooked streets of Montana Territory's most lawless settlement. Inside the Devil's Bargain Saloon, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies, pressed shoulder to shoulder around makeshift auction blocks.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Yellow lamplight flickered across faces twisted with hunger and greed, casting dancing shadows on walls stained with whiskey and blood from countless barroom brawls. Ezra Colt stood behind the bar like a king surveying his domain, his gold teeth gleaming in a predatory smile as he gestured toward the 3 women standing on wooden crates before the jeering crowd. His black suit was tailored and expensive, a stark contrast to the filth surrounding him, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had built his fortune on human misery. The registry book lay open before him, filled with the signatures of desperate men and the prices they were willing to pay for companionship in this godforsaken corner of the world. The crowd pressed closer to the makeshift stage, their boots grinding sawdust and tobacco spit into the warped floorboards. Miners with dirt still caked under their fingernails clutched bottles of rot-gut whiskey, their eyes shining with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with months of isolation in the mountains. Ranch hands who hadn't seen a woman in half a year elbowed each other for better views, their calloused hands gripping crumpled bills and bags of gold dust. Even the town's so-called respectable citizens had slithered out of their holes for this spectacle, hiding behind handkerchiefs and shadows, but unable to resist the pull of Blackwood's twisted marketplace. Charlotte Winters stood in the center of the auction block, her emerald dress torn at the shoulder and her auburn hair falling in disheveled waves around a face that bore the purple bruise of her recent blow. She had been a schoolteacher in Boston, educated and refined, until her father's gambling debts had forced her into an arrangement with Blackwood's marriage broker network. Her green eyes held defiance even in desperation, scanning the crowd with undisguised contempt for the men who saw her as nothing more than property to be bought and possessed. To her left stood Isabella Rodriguez, barely 19 years old, with dark hair braided down her back and a white cotton dress that had once been pristine but now bore the stains of a 3-week journey in a locked wagon. She had fled poverty in Mexico, answering an advertisement for domestic work that had turned out to be nothing more than Colt's elaborate trap. Her dark eyes darted nervously between the leering faces in the crowd, her hands trembling as she clutched a small wooden cross that hung from a chain around her neck. Every instinct told her to run, but the iron shackles around her ankles made escape impossible. On the right stood Margaret O'Brien, a sturdy Irish woman of 25, whose red hair blazed like fire in the lamplight, despite the fear in her blue eyes. She had been widowed in the Chicago fire and left with nothing but debts and desperation. Colt's agents had found her in a workhouse, promising her a respectable position as a housekeeper for a wealthy rancher. Instead, she found herself chained to an auction block, listening to men debate her worth like she was livestock at a cattle market. Her jaw was set with determination, and though tears streaked her freckled cheeks, her spine remained straight with Irish pride that no amount of humiliation could break. "Gentlemen," Colt's voice boomed across the saloon, cutting through the cacophony of drunken laughter and crude comments. He raised his hands for silence, his gold tooth glinting as his smile widened. "Tonight we have 3 fine specimens of womanhood, each guaranteed to provide companionship, cooking, and whatever other services a lonely man might require on the frontier." The crowd erupted in whoops and hollers that made the women flinch. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with rage and terror. Isabella whispered what sounded like prayers in Spanish, her fingers working the beads of a small rosary hidden in her palm. Margaret stood like a statue, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, refusing to acknowledge the degradation surrounding her. "We'll start with the schoolmarm," Colt announced, gesturing toward Charlotte with a theatrical flourish. "Look at them fine breeding lines, boys. This one's got education, which means she can read to your children and keep your books. Sturdy hips for birthing, and just enough fire in her to keep things interesting in the bedroom." Charlotte's face burned with shame and fury, but she kept her chin raised defiantly. A grizzled prospector near the front raised a dirty hand, waving a small leather pouch, $50 in gold dust. He shouted, his voice slurred with whiskey. $50? Colt scoffed dramatically. "Gentlemen, this is a lady of quality, not some common saloon girl. Look at them hands, soft as silk, never done a day's hard labor. And that face. Why, she's prettier than any picture I ever seen. Surely we can do better than $50. A cattle rancher named Bull Morrison pushed through the crowd, his massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller men around him. $75. He bellowed, his scarred face twisted in a leer. "And I'll throw in a side of beef for the wedding feast." The crowd laughed at his crude joke, but Charlotte's face went pale. She had heard stories about Bull Morrison, about how his previous 2 wives had both died under mysterious circumstances, and how he treated his ranch hands worse than animals. The thought of belonging to such a man made her stomach churn with revulsion. "Now we're talking," Colt exclaimed, scribbling notes in his ledger. "Do I hear 100? That was when the saloon doors exploded inward with a crash that silenced every voice in the room. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands, splintered off their hinges and crashed to the floor in a shower of splinters and dust. In the doorway stood a figure that seemed to fill the entire entrance, his presence commanding instant attention from every person in the saloon. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a long black duster coat that had seen hard travel, with silver spurs that caught the lamplight as he stepped over the ruined doors. His wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but the cold steel of his eyes was visible even in the dim light. Most striking of all was the pearl-handled Colt .45 that hung low on his right hip, positioned for a quick draw, and the Winchester rifle slung across his back. Everything about him spoke of wealth and danger in equal measure. "Evening, Colt," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily across the silent saloon despite its quiet tone. There was something in that voice, a cultured accent that spoke of education and refinement, but underneath it ran a current of steel that made even the hardest men in the room take a step back. Ezra Colt's confident smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure. Well. If it isn't Marcus Steele himself, gracing us common folk with his presence. Don't tell me the great cattle baron has come down from his ivory tower to bid on some female companionship. Like the rest of us. The crowd murmured with recognition and unease. Every man in Thunder Creek knew the name Marcus Steele, owner of the largest cattle ranch in the territory and one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi. His spread covered thousands of acres of prime grazing land, and his herds were legendary throughout the West. But more than his wealth, it was his reputation that made men nervous. Steele was known as a fair man but a dangerous one, quick to defend what he believed was right and deadly accurate with both pistol and rifle. Marcus Steele stepped into the saloon, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with deliberate precision. As he moved closer to the auction block, the crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. His eyes never left Colt's face, but Charlotte could see him taking in every detail of the scene. The chains around the women's ankles, the terror in their eyes, the predatory hunger of the crowd.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"I'm not here to bid, Colt," Steele said, his voice carrying a hint of something that made the saloon keeper's hand inch toward the shotgun behind the bar. "I'm here to shut this operation down." Colt's laugh was forced, but he tried to maintain his bravado. "Shut it down? On whose authority?" "Last I checked, this was still America, where a man could conduct his business as he sees fit. These women signed contracts, Steele. Legal, binding contracts." "Contracts signed under false pretenses," Steele replied, reaching into his coat and producing a folded document. "I had my lawyers look into your operation. Colt, turns out advertising for housekeepers and then selling women into marriage is considered fraud in most civilized places." He unfolded the document with a sharp snap, revealing an official-looking paper with several wax seals. "This is a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. And this," he added, producing a second document, "is a court order declaring all your marriage contracts null and void." The saloon erupted in angry shouts from the crowd. Men who had been counting on claiming a wife tonight found their hopes dashed by legal documents they couldn't read and didn't understand. Bull Morrison pushed toward the front, his massive fists clenched. "You can't just waltz in here and steal our women, Steele. We got rights too." "Your rights don't include buying human beings," Steele replied, his hand now resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "These women are free to go wherever they choose." Colt's face had gone red with rage, but he was too smart to directly challenge a man of Steele's reputation. Instead, he tried a different approach. "Even if them papers are real, which I doubt, you can't just take them. Where they gonna go? What they gonna do? At least here they'll have husbands to provide for them." "They'll come with me," Steele announced, causing another wave of angry muttering from the crowd. "I'll see that they get safe passage to wherever they want to go, and enough money to start new lives." Charlotte felt a surge of hope mixed with suspicion. In her experience, men who offered help always expected something in return, and she had learned to be wary of anyone who promised salvation. But there was something in Steele's manner, a quiet confidence and genuine anger at their situation, that made her want to believe him. Isabella had stopped praying and was staring at Steele with wide eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe that. Rescue had walked through the saloon doors. Margaret remained stoic, but Charlotte could see the tension in her shoulders, ease slightly for the first time since they had arrived in Thunder Creek. "Now hold on just a minute," Bull Morrison growled, stepping forward until he was face to face with Steele. Despite his size, Morrison had to look up slightly to meet the taller man's eyes. "I done put down good money for that redhead there, and I ain't leaving empty-handed. You want her, you can buy her from me fair and square." Steele's eyes went cold as winter steel. "She's not property to be bought and sold, Morrison. She's a human being with the right to choose her own fate." "Pretty words from a rich man," Morrison spat. "But out here in the real world, everything's got a price, even you, Steele." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as Morrison's hand dropped to his own pistol. He was known as a fast draw and a dead shot, and several men in the crowd began edging toward the exits, sensing that violence was about to erupt. "You're making a mistake, Morrison," Steele warned, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Walk away now, and you can go back to your ranch with your pride intact. Push this, and you won't be walking anywhere." But Morrison was drunk on whiskey and masculine pride, and the thought of backing down in front of half the town was more than his ego could bear. "I ain't afraid of no fancy cattle baron," he snarled. "You may have fooled everyone else into thinking you're some kind of hero, but I know what you really are, a killer with blood on his hands and money in his pocket." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, remembering stories they had heard about Steele's past, about the men who had challenged him and never lived to tell about it. But Steele's expression didn't change, and his voice remained steady. "I've killed men, Morrison. But only those who needed killing. Only those who thought they could prey on the innocent and face no consequences. Are you one of those men?" Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but he never cleared leather. Steele's draw was so fast it seemed almost magical. One moment his hand was at his side. The next his Colt .45 was pointed directly at Morrison's chest, the hammer cocked and ready to fire. The big rancher froze with his pistol half drawn, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized how close he had come to death. "Smart choice," Steele said quietly. "Now unbuckle that gun belt and kick it away from you." Morrison's face was purple with humiliation, but he wasn't stupid enough to test Steele's patience. With shaking hands, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floor, then kicked it away as instructed. "Anyone else want to discuss the price of human dignity?" Steele asked, addressing the crowd without taking his eyes off Morrison. The question was met with silence and the sound of boots shuffling as men looked anywhere but at the man holding the gun. Colt had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, realizing that his profitable auction was falling apart before his eyes. "You can't just take them, Steele," he protested. "Even if them papers are real, you got no right to interfere with my business." "Your business is finished, Colt," Steele replied, finally holstering his pistol but keeping his hand near it. "These women are coming with me, and if you try to stop me, you'll answer to federal marshals." Steele climbed onto the auction platform and began examining the shackles around the women's ankles. The iron bands were secured with heavy padlocks, but he produced a small metal tool from his vest pocket and began working on the locks with surprising skill. "How do we know you ain't just another buyer?" Charlotte asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the angry muttering of the crowd. "How do we know you won't just take us somewhere else and do the same thing?" Steele looked up from the lock he was working on, meeting her eyes directly. "Because I've seen what happens to women in places like this, and I've seen what men like Colt do to people who can't fight back. My mother was sold into marriage when she was 16, traded like livestock to pay her father's debts. She died giving birth to her 7th child, worn out by years of abuse and neglect. I swore on her grave that I'd never let another woman suffer the same fate if I had the power to prevent it." There was something in his voice, a pain that ran deeper than anger, that convinced Charlotte he was telling the truth. The first shackle clicked open, and she felt the heavy iron fall away from her ankle, like a physical weight being lifted from her soul. Isabella was next, tears streaming down her face as Steele freed her from her bonds. "Gracias," she whispered. In Spanish, "Gracias por salvar nuestras vidas." Steele nodded, understanding her words even if he didn't speak Spanish fluently. Margaret was last, and as her shackles fell away, she surprised everyone by speaking for the first time that evening. "Why?" she asked in her soft Irish brogue. "Why risk your life for strangers?" "Because someone has to," Steele replied simply. "Because if good people don't stand up to evil, then evil wins." As the 3 women climbed down from the auction platform, Colt made one last desperate attempt to salvage his operation. "You're making a mistake, Steele," he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "These women ain't innocent victims. They knew what they were signing up for. They wanted to come west, wanted to find husbands. I was just helping them out." Charlotte turned to face him, her green eyes blazing with fury. "Helping us? You locked us in wagons for 3 weeks. You chained us like animals. You told us we were coming to work as housekeepers and teachers, not to be sold like slaves. And the men you were selling us to," Isabella added, finding her voice despite her fear, "they were not good men. They spoke of us like we were cattle, like we existed only for their pleasure." Margaret stepped forward, her Irish temper finally overcoming her shock. In my country, we have a word for men like you, Colt. We call them slave traders, and we hang them from trees." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the women's testimonies revealed the true nature of Colt's operation. Even some of the men who had been bidding on them began to look ashamed of their participation in what was clearly a criminal enterprise. But Colt wasn't finished. Reaching under the bar, he pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and pointed it directly at Steele. "You ain't taking my property nowhere, Steele. I got too much invested in this business to let some high and mighty cattle baron shut me down." The saloon exploded into chaos as men dove for cover behind tables and chairs. Steele pushed the three women behind the auction platform and drew his pistol in one smooth motion, but Colt already had the drop on him. "Drop it, Steele, or I'll blow you in half." For a moment, it seemed as though Steele's rescue attempt would end in disaster. But then a new voice cut through the confusion, calm, authoritative, and utterly unexpected. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Colt." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley standing in the ruined doorway, his badge glinting in the lamplight, and a rifle trained on Colt's back. Behind him stood three federal marshals, their weapons drawn and their faces grim with purpose. "Seems like Mr. Steele's papers are genuine after all," Bradley continued, stepping into the saloon with his rifle never wavering from its target. "And seems like you've been running quite an operation here, Colt. Human trafficking, fraud, kidnapping. That's enough charges to see you hanged twice over." Colt's face went white as he realized his empire was crumbling around him. The shotgun in his hands trembled as he looked from the sheriff to the marshals to Steele, calculating his chances of fighting his way out of the situation. "Don't do it, Colt," Steele warned, his pistol now aimed directly at the saloon keeper's head. "You're outgunned and outnumbered. Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Colt wavered on the edge of a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. The saloon held its breath, waiting to see if greed and desperation would overcome common sense. Then, with a curse that would have made the devil blush, Colt slowly lowered his shotgun and placed it on the bar. "This ain't over, Steele," he snarled as the marshals moved in to arrest him. "You think you can just ride in here and play hero? But Thunder Creek ain't your town. There's others who won't take kindly to your interference." As the marshals led Colt away in chains, Steele turned to the three women who stood behind the ruined auction platform, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering fear. "Ladies," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "in a gesture of respect, my carriage is waiting outside. If you'll allow me, I'd like to take you somewhere safe where you can decide what you want to do with your lives." Charlotte looked at Isabella and Margaret, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in their eyes. They had been rescued from one dangerous situation, but they still knew nothing about the man who had saved them or what he might expect in return. "Where?" Charlotte asked cautiously. "My ranch," Steele replied. "It's about 20 miles south of here, and I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe there. You can stay as long as you need to, and when you're ready, I'll arrange passage to wherever you want to go." As the three women followed Marcus Steele out of the Devil's Bargain Saloon and into the cold Montana night, none of them could have imagined that their ordeal was far from over. Forces had been set in motion that would test their courage, their trust, and their very will to survive in ways they couldn't possibly foresee. But for now, for this moment, they were free. The carriage ride through the Montana wilderness was unlike anything the three women had experienced. Marcus Steele's vehicle was no ordinary frontier wagon, but a luxurious coach with leather seats and brass fittings that spoke of wealth beyond their imagination. The horses pulling it were magnificent black stallions, their coats gleaming in the moonlight as they navigated the treacherous mountain paths with practiced ease. Charlotte sat across from Steele, studying his face in the dim light provided by the carriage's oil lamps. Even in the shadows, she could see the sharp angles of his jaw, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent under the harsh frontier sun, and something else, a darkness that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface of his civilized exterior. She had heard whispers about Marcus Steele during her brief time in Thunder Creek, stories that painted him as both savior and destroyer, depending on who was telling the tale. Isabella huddled in the corner of the carriage, still clutching her small wooden cross and whispering prayers in Spanish. The terror of the auction still showed in her dark eyes, and she flinched every time the carriage hit a bump or the wind howled through the mountain passes. Margaret sat stoically beside her, her Irish pride keeping her spine straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at her features. "Where exactly are we going?" Charlotte asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the group. Steele looked up from the documents he had been reviewing by lamplight. "Steel Canyon Ranch. It's been my home for 15 years, ever since I came west with nothing but a horse and a dream of building something worthwhile in this godforsaken territory." "And what makes you think we'll be safe there?" Margaret asked, her Irish accent thickening with suspicion. "In my experience, men who claim to be saviors usually want something in return." A ghost of a smile crossed Steele's face. "Smart woman. You're right to be suspicious. In this territory, trust is a luxury most people can't afford. But I'm not most people, and Steel Canyon Ranch isn't most places." He leaned forward, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight. "My ranch covers 50,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana Territory. I employ over 200 men, cowboys, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, and everything in between. It's a complete community, with its own store, school, church, and medical facility. Most importantly, it has rules that everyone follows, starting with the fundamental principle that no person is property of another." Charlotte felt a stirring of hope mixed with continued wariness. "And what would be expected of us in this paradise of yours?" "Nothing more than you're willing to give," Steele replied. "If you want to work, there are positions available. The school needs teachers, the medical facility needs nurses, the main house needs domestic staff. If you want to rest and recover from your ordeal, you're welcome to do that too. And when you're ready to leave and start your lives elsewhere, I'll provide transportation and enough money to get you established." Isabella looked up from her prayers. For the first time since entering the carriage, "Pourquoi?" she asked softly. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Steele was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the moonlit landscape rushing past. "Because I know what it's like to be powerless," he finally said. "And because I've learned that wealth without purpose is just another form of poverty." As the carriage climbed higher into the mountains, Steele began to share pieces of his story, not the sanitized version that appeared in newspaper articles about his business success, but the raw truth that had shaped him into the man he had become. "I wasn't born wealthy," he began, his voice taking on a distant quality as he recalled memories that clearly still pained him. "My father was a sharecropper in Georgia, barely scraping by on land that belonged to other men. My mother, as I mentioned, was sold into marriage to pay her family's debts. She was 16 when she became my father's wife, and she spent the next 20 years bearing children and burying dreams." Charlotte found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite her reservations about the man telling it. "When the war came, my father joined the Confederate Army, not because he believed in the cause, but because it was the only way to feed his family. He died at Gettysburg, leaving my mother with 7 children and debts that would have taken a lifetime to pay. The landowner who held our note decided to collect in ways that had nothing to do with money." The temperature in the carriage seemed to drop as Steele's voice grew colder. "I was 15 when I killed my first man, the landowner's son, who thought my mother was part of the property he had inherited. I put a kitchen knife between his ribs and watched him die on our cabin floor." Isabella gasped and crossed herself, while Margaret's eyes widened with a mixture of horror and understanding. Charlotte felt her stomach clench, but she didn't look away from Steele's face. After that, there was no staying in Georgia. I took what little money we had hidden and headed west, leaving my mother and siblings behind with promises to send for them once I had established myself. It took me 3 years to earn enough to bring them out to Montana, and by then, it was too late. My mother had died of pneumonia, and my siblings had been scattered to relatives and orphanages across the South. The weight of old guilt hung heavy. In Steele's voice, I had the money to save them, but I was too late. That's when I learned that wealth without action is meaningless, and that power unused is just another form of cowardice. As dawn broke over the mountains, Steele Canyon Ranch came into view, and all 3 women gasped at the sight that greeted them. The ranch was not the crude frontier settlement they had expected, but a sprawling complex that resembled a small city. More than a typical cattle operation, the main house was a magnificent 3-story structure built of local stone and timber, with wraparound porches and large windows that caught the morning sunlight. Surrounding it were dozens of other buildings, bunkhouses, barns, workshops, and what appeared to be residential homes for married employees. Gardens and orchards dotted the landscape, and a small river ran through the center of the settlement, providing fresh water and power for a sawmill and grist mill. But what struck the women most was the obvious prosperity and contentment of the people. They could see beginning their daily routines. Cowboys heading out to tend the herds looked well-fed and well-equipped. Women hanging laundry on lines between the houses wore clean, well-made clothing. Children played in yards that showed the care and attention of families who expected to stay in one place for a long time. "Mother of God," Margaret whispered, her Irish accent thick with amazement. "It's like something out of a fairy tale." Steele smiled, and for the first time since they had met him, the expression seemed to reach his eyes. "It's taken 15 years to build, and it's not finished yet. But it's home to over 400 people now, and every one of them is here by choice." As the carriage rolled through the main gate, an impressive archway made of local stone with Steele Canyon Ranch carved in elegant letters across the top. People stopped their work to wave and call out greetings to their employer. But Charlotte noticed something else in their expressions: genuine respect and affection, not the fearful deference she had expected to see from employees toward their boss. The carriage pulled up in front of the main house, where a small group of people had gathered to welcome the new arrivals. At the head of the group stood a tall, elegant woman in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. She was dressed simply but expensively, in a way that spoke of natural refinement rather than ostentation. "Ladies," Steele said as he helped them down from the carriage, "I'd like you to meet Eleanor Hartwell, my ranch manager and the closest thing to family I have left in this world." Eleanor stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately put the 3 women at ease. "Welcome to Steele Canyon Ranch," she said, her cultured voice carrying just a hint of an Eastern accent. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." Behind Eleanor stood Dr. Samuel Morrison, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands who immediately began assessing the women for signs of injury or illness. Beside him was Mrs. Chun, a small Chinese woman who served as the ranch's head cook, and Father Miguel Santos, a young Mexican priest who had established the ranch's chapel and school. "These people will help you get settled," Steele explained. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms and explain how things work around here. Dr. Morrison will tend to any medical needs you might have. Mrs. Chun will make sure you're fed properly. I suspect you haven't had a decent meal in weeks. And Father Santos is available if you need someone to talk to about ... spiritual matters." Charlotte found herself impressed despite her continued wariness. The level of organization and care evident in Steele's arrangements suggested a man who was genuinely concerned with their welfare, not someone who saw them as potential conquests or servants. As the group moved toward the main house, Eleanor fell into step beside Charlotte. Mr. Steele told me a little about your situation, she said quietly. I want you to know that you're not the first women he's rescued from places like Thunder Creek. Charlotte's eyebrows rose in surprise. He's done this before? Several times over the past few years, Eleanor confirmed. There's a network of people who profit from human misery throughout the territory. Traders who deal in women and children, mine owners who use slave labor, ranchers who treat their workers worse than animals. Marcus has made it his personal mission to disrupt their operations whenever possible. And what happens to the people he rescues? Margaret asked, having overheard the conversation. Eleanor smiled. Some choose to stay and make new lives here on the ranch. Others move on once they've recovered from their ordeals. A few have even gone back east to reconnect with families they were separated from. The choice is always theirs. Isabella, who had been listening intently despite the language barrier, spoke up in halting English. He is good man, see? He's a complicated man, Eleanor replied diplomatically. He's done things he's not proud of, and he's made enemies throughout the territory. But at his core, yes, I believe he's a good man trying to make amends for past mistakes. As they toured the ranch facilities, Charlotte began to notice details that suggested Steel Canyon Ranch was more than just a prosperous cattle operation. Many of the cowboys wore their guns like men who knew how to use them, and she spotted several men who looked more like professional gunfighters than typical ranch hands. The buildings were constructed with thick walls and small windows, designed more for defense than comfort. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of military style, organization and discipline. Mrs. Hartwell, she said during a quiet moment, this place looks more like a fortress than a ranch. Eleanor's expression grew serious. In many ways, it is. Marcus has made powerful enemies with his rescue operations, and they've tried more than once to retaliate against him and the people under his protection. We've learned to be prepared for trouble. What kind of enemies? Margaret asked, her practical Irish nature demanding specifics. Men like Ezra Colt, for starters, Eleanor replied. He was just the local face of a much larger operation that spans several territories. There are people who make enormous profits from human trafficking, and they don't appreciate having their business disrupted. She paused beside a window that looked out over the ranch's central courtyard. Then there are the political enemies, territorial officials who take bribes to look the other way, federal marshals who are more concerned with maintaining order than enforcing justice, military commanders who profit from conflicts between settlers and Native Americans. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. So by rescuing us, Steele has put all of you in danger? The danger was already here, Eleanor said firmly. Marcus learned long ago that neutrality in the face of evil is just another form of collaboration. We've chosen our side, and we're prepared to defend it. That evening, as the three women sat down to their first real meal in weeks, they found themselves at a crossroads. The food was excellent. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast that included fresh bread, roasted beef, vegetables from the ranch's gardens, and desserts that reminded them of civilization and comfort. The dining room was elegant, but not ostentatious, decorated with local artwork and furniture that spoke of craftsmanship and care. But underlying the warmth and hospitality was an undercurrent of tension that none of them could ignore. They were safe for the moment, but they were also isolated in the middle of hostile territory, dependent on the protection of a man they barely knew and weren't sure they could trust. What do you think? Charlotte asked quietly as they prepared for bed. In the comfortable rooms they had been assigned in the main house. I think we're alive, fed, and sleeping in real beds instead of chains, Margaret replied pragmatically. That's more than we had this morning, Isabella nodded agreement. El Señor Steele, he saved our lives, but ... She struggled with the English words, but I do not understand why. In my village, no one helps strangers without wanting something. Charlotte stared out the window at the moonlit landscape surrounding the ranch. In the distance, she could see the flickering campfires of the night watch, men who patrolled the ranch's boundaries to watch for trouble. It was both comforting and unsettling, evidence of protection, but also proof that they were in a place where such protection was necessary. Charlotte was awakened in the middle of the night by a soft tapping at her window. She sat up in bed, her heart racing as she tried to determine if she had imagined the sound. Then it came again, 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, she crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first she saw nothing but shadows and moonlight, but then a figure stepped forward from the darkness beside the house. It was a woman, dressed in dark clothing and gesturing urgently for Charlotte to open the window. Against her better judgment, Charlotte lifted the window sash just enough to allow conversation. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who wants to help you," the woman replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that Charlotte couldn't place. "You're in terrible danger here, more than you know. Steele isn't the savior he pretends to be. He's a killer and a fraud who collects women like trophies." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? How many other rescued women have you seen on this ranch?" the woman asked urgently. "Where are all the other survivors of his previous rescue operations? Ask yourself why a wealthy man would risk his life and fortune to save strangers, and what he might expect in return." Before Charlotte could respond, the woman pressed a small piece of paper into her hand through the window opening. "Read this when you're alone," she whispered. "And remember, if you want to escape this place alive, you'll need help from people who know the truth about Marcus Steele." The woman melted back into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Charlotte staring at the paper in her trembling hands. Should she wake Isabella and Margaret? Should she tell Eleanor Hartwell about the mysterious visitor? Or should she wait until morning and pretend the encounter had never happened? Unable to sleep, Charlotte lit a candle and carefully unfolded the paper the mysterious woman had given her. What she read made her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and doubt. Marcus Steele is not what he seems. 3 years ago, he rescued 5 women from a situation similar to yours. They were brought to Steele Canyon Ranch with the same promises of safety and freedom. None of them were ever seen again. 2 years ago, it was 4 women from a mining camp brothel. Last year, 6 women from a wagon train that was attacked by bandits. The official story is always the same. They chose to move on to start new lives elsewhere. But there are no records of them reaching any destination, no letters sent to families, no traces of their existence beyond the gates of Steele Canyon Ranch. Steele has built his reputation as a rescuer and reformer, but the truth is far darker. He collects women who have no families to miss them, no connections to make inquiries about their fate. He uses them for his own purposes, and when he grows tired of them, they disappear forever. If you want to live, you must escape before it's too late. There are people who can help you, but you must be willing to trust those who know the real Marcus Steele. Meet me tomorrow night at the old mine shaft, half a mile north of the ranch. Come alone and tell no one. Your life depends on it." The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom was a small drawing of a rose, a symbol that meant nothing to Charlotte, but which was rendered with careful detail. Charlotte's hands shook as she refolded the paper and hid it in her clothing. Everything she had observed about Steele Canyon Ranch suddenly took on a sinister cast. The defensive preparations, the armed guards, the isolation from the outside world. Were these measures to protect the people on the ranch, or to prevent them from escaping? And where were all the other women Steele claimed to have rescued? In all her touring of the ranch facilities, she had seen families, cowboys, workers of all kinds, but no single women who might have been previous rescue cases. The absence that she had barely noticed before now loomed large in her mind. Dawn came gray and cold. matching Charlotte's troubled mood as she joined Isabella and Margaret for breakfast. Both women seemed rested and more optimistic than they had since the ordeal began, chatting quietly about the comfortable beds and kind treatment they had received. "Did you sleep well?" Margaret asked, noticing Charlotte's distracted manner. "Well, enough," Charlotte lied, unwilling to share her midnight encounter until she had decided what to believe. "I was just thinking about our situation." Eleanor Hartwell joined them at the breakfast table, bringing news that Marcus Steele had left before dawn on urgent business in town. "He expects to be back by evening," she explained. "In the meantime, I thought we might continue your tour of the ranch and discuss what options might interest you for the future." Charlotte forced herself to smile and nod, but her mind was racing. Steele's absence might be routine business, or it might be connected to the mysterious woman's warning. Either way, it gave her time to investigate the claims in the letter without arousing suspicion. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said carefully, "Mr. Steele mentioned that we're not the first women he's rescued. Are any of the others still here on the ranch? I'd like to meet them and hear about their experiences." Eleanor's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, so briefly that Charlotte might have imagined it. "Unfortunately, no. The previous groups have all chosen to move on to other opportunities. Some went back east to reunite with families, others headed west to California. Marcus always respects their choices, even when we're sorry to see them go." "That must be disappointing for Mr. Steele," Margaret commented. "After going to such trouble to rescue people, it must be difficult when they leave." "Marcus understands that freedom means the right to choose your own path," Eleanor replied smoothly. "He's proud when the people he's helped are able to start successful new lives elsewhere." But Charlotte caught something in Eleanor's tone, a rehearsed quality that suggested she had given this explanation many times before. The same doubts that had plagued her during the night began to resurface with renewed intensity. As they toured the ranch that morning, Charlotte found herself paying attention to details she had missed the day before. The perimeter guards were more numerous and better armed than she had initially realized. The workers, while clearly well treated, had a disciplined quality that spoke of military organization rather than typical ranch operations. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of wealth that seemed almost excessive for a cattle operation. No matter how successful. Most troubling of all was the absence that the mysterious letter had pointed out. In a community of over 400 people, there should have been at least some single women among the population. Previous rescue cases who had chosen to stay, female relatives of workers, women who had come to the territory seeking employment or opportunity. But Charlotte realized she had seen none, only married women and the wives of ranch employees. The realization that she, Isabella, and Margaret might be walking into the same trap that had claimed their predecessors filled Charlotte with a cold dread that no amount of ranch hospitality could dispel. But it also filled her with a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might prove to be. As evening approached, and Marcus Steele's return grew imminent, Charlotte faced the most difficult decision of her life: trust the man who had rescued them from certain doom, or trust the mysterious woman who claimed that rescue was just another form of trap. The choice she made would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of Isabella and Margaret as well. And as the sun set over Steel Canyon Ranch, Charlotte realized that her ordeal was far from over. It was just beginning. The old mine shaft stood like a gaping wound in the mountainside, its entrance partially collapsed and overgrown with brambles. That caught at Charlotte's dress as she approached in the darkness. The moon was new, providing little light to guide her way, and she had to rely on the small lantern she had stolen from the ranch's supply shed. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, and every sound made her heart race with the possibility of discovery. She had left Isabella and Margaret sleeping peacefully in their comfortable beds, unable to burden them with her doubts until she knew more about the truth of their situation. The letter hidden in her corset seemed to burn against her skin, its accusations echoing in her mind with each step she took away from the false security of Steel Canyon Ranch. The mysterious woman emerged from the mine entrance like a ghost, her dark clothing making her nearly invisible against the rock face. In the lantern light, Charlotte could see that she was perhaps 30 years old, with striking features marred by a long scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline. Her eyes held the hardened look of someone who had seen too much violence and survived too much betrayal. "You came," the woman said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and surprise. "I wasn't sure you would have the courage." "I'm not sure I do," Charlotte admitted, setting down the lantern and studying the stranger's face. "But I need to know the truth. Who are you, and how do you know about the other women?" The woman stepped closer, her scarred face becoming clearer in the lamplight. "My name is Victoria Blackthorn, and I was one of Marcus Steele's rescued women 3 years ago. I'm the only one who managed to escape Steel Canyon Ranch alive." Charlotte felt her blood turn to ice. The only one? What happened to the others? Victoria's expression grew haunted, as if she were seeing ghosts that only she could perceive. "Steele has perfected the art of making people disappear without anyone asking questions. He chooses his victims carefully. Women with no families, no connections, no one who will come looking for them if they vanish. He rescues them from obvious dangers, brings them to his ranch, and then—" She paused, struggling with memories that clearly still caused her pain. "He doesn't kill them outright. That would be too crude, too obvious. Instead, he breaks them down slowly, systematically. He isolates them from each other, makes them dependent on his protection and generosity. He studies their weaknesses, their fears, their desperate desires for safety and belonging. And then he uses those vulnerabilities to control them completely." Charlotte's hand shook as she absorbed the implications. "But why? What does he gain from this?" "Power," Victoria replied simply. "Marcus Steele is a man who was powerless for too long, and now he's addicted to the feeling of controlling other people's lives. The money, the ranch, the reputation, they're all just tools to feed his real addiction, which is the absolute dominion over human souls." Victoria led Charlotte deeper into the mine shaft, where she had created a hidden camp complete with supplies and documentation that told a horrifying story. By the light of several carefully shielded lanterns, Charlotte examined newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, and detailed notes that revealed the true scope of Steele's operations. "This is Mary Catherine O'Sullivan," Victoria said, pointing to a photograph of a young woman with red hair and laughing eyes. "She was part of my group 3 years ago. Steele convinced her that she was special, that he cared for her personally. He gave her beautiful clothes, jewelry, a private room in the main house. She thought she was falling in love with him." Charlotte studied the photograph, seeing something familiar in the woman's features. "She looks like Margaret." "Steele has a type," Victoria confirmed grimly. "He's drawn to women with spirit, intelligence, and beauty, women who represent a challenge to his control. The more independent and strong-willed they are, the more satisfaction he gets from breaking them." She showed Charlotte another photograph, this one of a dark-haired woman with intelligent eyes. "This is Carmen Esperanza. She was a schoolteacher from New Mexico, rescued from a situation very similar to yours. Steele appointed her to run the ranch school, made her feel important and valued. She never suspected that she was just another trophy in his collection. What happened to them?" Charlotte asked, though she dreaded the answer. Victoria's scarred face twisted with grief and rage. Mary Catherine discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, evidence of what had happened to previous groups of women. When she tried to confront Steele about it, she simply disappeared. The official story was that she had decided to leave the ranch to pursue opportunities in San Francisco. But I saw her body being buried in an unmarked grave in the hills behind the ranch. Charlotte felt sick to her stomach. And Carmen? She lasted longer, almost a year. She genuinely believed she was helping to build something worthwhile, educating the children of ranch workers and creating a better future for the community. But when she started asking questions about why no single women ever visited the ranch, why no letters ever came from the women who had supposedly moved on to other opportunities, Steele decided she had become a liability. Victoria pulled out a detailed map of the ranch and surrounding area, marked with red X's that made Charlotte's blood run cold. These are the burial sites I've been able to locate. 17 women over the past 5 years, all of them rescued by Marcus Steele, all of them now feeding the wildflowers in hidden graves throughout the mountains. How did you survive? Charlotte asked, staring at the evidence of systematic murder that surrounded her. Victoria touched the scar on her face unconsciously. I was lucky, and I was suspicious from the beginning. My father was a criminal investigator in Chicago before he died, and he taught me to pay attention to details. That didn't add up. The absence of other single women on the ranch, the military-style discipline that seemed excessive for a cattle operation, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, it all pointed to something being wrong. She pulled out a small notebook filled with her careful observations. I started documenting everything: guard rotations, supply deliveries, the comings and goings of ranch personnel. I discovered that Steele has connections to criminal organizations throughout the territory, and that Steele Canyon Ranch is used as a base for operations that go far beyond cattle ranching. Charlotte leaned forward, desperate for any information that might help her protect Isabella and Margaret. What kind of operations? Gun running mostly. Steele sells weapons to both sides in conflicts between settlers and Native Americans, profiting from the violence while maintaining his public image as a peace-loving cattleman. He also provides safe haven for outlaws who pay him a percentage of their takings, and he's been known to eliminate business rivals through carefully orchestrated accidents. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. But the women are his personal obsession. He doesn't kill them for money or strategic advantage. He kills them because he enjoys the process of seduction, manipulation, and ultimate betrayal. It's a game to him, and we're nothing more than playing pieces. She stood up and began gathering supplies from her hidden cache. I've been planning your escape since I heard about the auction in Thunder Creek. There's a narrow canyon about 5 miles north of here that leads to an old mining road. If we can reach it without being detected, we can follow it to a trading post where a friend of mine can provide transportation to safety. Charlotte felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. What about Isabella and Margaret? I can't leave them behind. We'll have to go back for them, Victoria agreed. But it won't be easy. Steele will have returned by now, and he'll be suspicious if you're missing from your room. We'll need to create a distraction, something that will draw the guards away from the main house long enough for us to get the other women and escape. The journey back to Steele Canyon Ranch felt like descending into the depths of hell. Every familiar landmark now seemed sinister, every sign of prosperity and organization a facade hiding unspeakable evil. Charlotte's mind raced with the implications of what she had learned, and with the desperate knowledge that she and her companions were living on borrowed time. Victoria accompanied her partway, then melted back into the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who had been hunted for years. Remember, she whispered before disappearing, trust no one on the ranch. Eleanor Hartwell, Dr. Morrison, all of them. They're either willing participants in Steele's crimes, or they're too afraid to act against him. You're on your own until we can get you out of there. Charlotte slipped back into the main house, through the same window she had used to leave, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire household. But the corridors remained silent, and she managed to reach her room without being detected. As she changed out of her muddy clothes and tried to calm her racing pulse, she heard the sound of horses approaching the main entrance. Marcus Steele had returned from his business in town. The next morning brought a dramatic change in the atmosphere. At Steel Canyon Ranch, where the previous days had been filled with warmth and hospitality, now there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone from the ranch hands to the domestic staff. Charlotte noticed that the guards had been doubled around the main house, and that several men she hadn't seen before had taken up positions at strategic points throughout the complex. At breakfast, Marcus Steele appeared more subdued than usual, his gray eyes watchful as he observed the three women. "I hope you all slept well," he said, his voice carrying a subtle undertone that made Charlotte's skin crawl. "I'm afraid my business in town brought some disturbing news." Isabella and Margaret looked up from their plates with expressions of concern, but Charlotte forced herself to maintain a neutral expression despite the panic rising in her chest. "It seems," Steele continued, cutting his meat with deliberate precision, "that there are dangerous elements in the area, outlaws, and renegades who prey on isolated ranches and vulnerable travelers. For your safety, I'm going to have to ask that you remain close to the main house for the next few days." Eleanor Hartwell nodded agreement from her position at the foot of the table. "It's just a precaution, of course. We want to make sure nothing happens to you while you're under our protection." Charlotte recognized the words for what they were, a polite way of saying they were now prisoners. The comfortable guest accommodations had become a luxurious jail, and their kind hosts had revealed themselves as jailers. "How long do you expect this danger to last?" Margaret asked, her practical Irish nature seeking specific information. Steele's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's difficult to say. These things have a way of resolving themselves. Given time. But I want to assure you that you'll be perfectly safe as long as you follow the rules and don't venture outside the immediate area of the main house." Despite the increased security, Charlotte was desperate to verify Victoria's claims and find evidence that would convince Isabella and Margaret of their danger. She began paying closer attention to the details of ranch life, looking for the inconsistencies and suspicious activities that Victoria had warned her about. Her first discovery came that afternoon when she observed a supply wagon arriving at the ranch. Instead of the usual provisions and equipment, the wagon was loaded with wooden crates that were handled with unusual care and quickly moved to a secured storage building. The men who unloaded the crates were armed and alert, treating the cargo as if it were extremely valuable or dangerous. Later, while pretending to read in the main house library, Charlotte overheard a conversation between Steele and a man she didn't recognize, a rough-looking individual with the unmistakable bearing of a professional gunfighter. "The job in Silver Creek went as planned," the man reported in a low voice. "No survivors, no witnesses. It'll look like an Indian raid, just like you wanted." Steele's response chilled Charlotte to the bone. "Excellent. That should discourage any other mining operations from moving into the area. We can't have competition interfering with our arrangements." The casual way they discussed murder and deception confirmed Victoria's warnings about Steele's true nature. This was not a man who rescued women out of altruism. This was a predator who used rescue as a hunting technique. That evening, Steele made his first direct move on Charlotte, inviting her to join him for a private dinner in his study. Room was elegantly appointed with leather-bound books, expensive furniture, and artwork that spoke of cultured tastes and considerable wealth. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the table was set with fine china and crystal that caught the lamplight like captured stars. "I hope you don't mind the intimate setting," Steele said as he poured wine into her glass. "I thought it would be nice to have a chance to speak privately, without the constraints of group conversation." Charlotte accepted the wine but barely touched it, aware that drugging would be a simple way to gain control over a potential victim. "It's very kind of you to go to such trouble." Steele sat across from her, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're not like the others, Charlotte. There's something special about you, an intelligence, a strength of character that I find extraordinarily attractive." The words were similar to what Victoria had described in her account of Mary Catherine's seduction, and Charlotte felt her skin crawl with the knowledge of what they really meant. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mr. Steele, but I'm not sure what you expect from me." "I expect nothing," he replied smoothly, "but I hope for a great deal. You see, I've been alone for many years, focused on building this ranch and establishing my place in the territory. But lately, I've begun to think that success without someone to share it with is rather hollow." He leaned forward, his voice taking on an intimate tone. "I know this is sudden, and I know you have no reason to trust me completely yet. But I'd like you to consider the possibility of making Steel Canyon Ranch your permanent home, not as a guest or an employee, but as my partner in everything I've built here." Charlotte's heart raced with terror disguised as excitement. "Mr. Steele, I don't know what to say. This is very unexpected." "Say you'll think about it," he urged, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Say you'll give me a chance to prove that I can make you happy, that together we can build something even greater than what exists here now." His touch felt like ice against her skin, and Charlotte had to fight the urge to pull away immediately. Instead, she forced herself to smile and nod. "I'll certainly think about it. But I hope you understand that I need time to process everything that's happened. Just a few days ago, I was facing a very different future." "Of course," Steele agreed, though she could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. But remember, out here in the wilderness, opportunities for happiness and security are rare. When they present themselves, it's wise not to let them slip away." After the dinner, Charlotte returned to her room with her mind spinning with the implications of Steele's proposal. Everything Victoria had told her was coming true exactly as predicted. The isolation, the seduction, the gradual escalation of control and manipulation. She found Isabella and Margaret waiting for her, their faces creased with worry. "Where have you been?" Margaret asked. "We were concerned when you didn't return from the library." Charlotte looked at her two companions, seeing the trust and innocence in their faces, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "And we need to be very careful about who might overhear us." She told them everything, about the midnight meeting with Victoria, about the evidence of previous murders, about the true nature of Marcus Steele and Steel Canyon Ranch. She watched their expressions change from disbelief to horror, to grim determination as the truth sank in. "Mother of God," Margaret whispered, "we've walked from one trap into another." Isabella clutched her wooden cross and whispered prayers in Spanish, but her dark eyes were steady with resolve. "Que hacemos?" she asked. "What do we do?" "We escape," Charlotte said firmly. "Victoria has a plan, but it's dangerous. We'll have to move tonight, before Steele becomes suspicious about my behavior." Margaret nodded grimly. "Better to die trying to escape than to wait for him to kill us at his leisure." The three women spent the remaining hours before midnight preparing for their escape. They gathered what few possessions they couldn't bear to leave behind, dressed in their darkest clothing, and tried to memorize the route Victoria had described. To the hidden canyon, Charlotte had left her window unlocked during her previous nighttime excursion, and it opened silently to allow them access to the roof of the wraparound porch. From there, they could drop to the ground and make their way to the agreed-upon meeting point without passing through the main corridors of the house. The night was overcast, providing the darkness they needed, but also making navigation more difficult. They moved like shadows across the ranch grounds, freezing whenever they heard the sound of guards making their rounds or the whinny of horses in the nearby corrals. Victoria was waiting for them at the edge of the forest, armed with rifles and supplies for the journey ahead. "You made it," she said with relief. "I wasn't sure they would let you move around freely enough to escape." "Steele made his move tonight," Charlotte reported. "He tried to seduce me with promises of partnership and marriage. We don't have much time before he expects an answer. Victoria's scarred face hardened with determination. Then we need to move fast. Once he realizes you're gone, he'll send every man on the ranch after us. Our only chance is to reach the canyon before dawn and follow the mining road to safety. As they plunged into the dark forest, following paths that only Victoria knew, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had been too easy. For a man who had successfully murdered 17 women without detection, Marcus Steele seemed remarkably unprepared for the possibility that his latest victims might try to flee. The feeling of being watched, of walking into a trap rather than escaping from one, grew stronger with each step they took away from Steel Canyon Ranch. And when the sound of pursuing horses reached their ears less than an hour into their flight, Charlotte realized that Marcus Steele had been playing a much more sophisticated game than any of them had imagined. The hunt had begun, and they were the prey in a deadly game where the stakes were not just their lives, but their very souls. In the darkness of the Montana wilderness, with killers closing in from behind and uncertain safety somewhere ahead, the three women faced the most terrifying night of their lives, but they also faced it together, and that unity would prove to be their greatest weapon against the evil that pursued them through the shadows of the frontier night. The thundering hoofbeats behind them grew closer with each passing minute, and Victoria's face had gone pale with a realization that chilled Charlotte to the bone. He knew, Victoria gasped as they stumbled through the dense underbrush. Steele knew we'd try to escape tonight. This whole thing has been orchestrated. Charlotte's lungs burned as she helped Isabella navigate the treacherous mountain path. In the darkness, "What do you mean orchestrated?" "Think about it," Victoria panted, her scarred face twisted with bitter understanding. The increased security, the casual mention of danger in the area, the romantic dinner, he was setting the stage. He wanted you to feel trapped, wanted you to attempt an escape so he could enjoy the hunt. Margaret stumbled over a fallen log, cursing in Gaelic as thorns tore at her dress. "You mean he's been playing with us like a cat with mice?" "Worse than that," Victoria replied, leading them toward what appeared to be a sheer cliff face. "Marcus Steele is a man who has grown bored with easy victories. The previous women were too trusting, too broken by their circumstances to provide real sport. But you three, educated, strong-willed, suspicious, you represent the ultimate challenge." The sound of baying hounds joined the thunder of horses, and Charlotte felt her heart sink. Steele had brought tracking dogs, making their escape through the wilderness nearly impossible. Victoria pressed her hands against what appeared to be solid rock, and to the women's amazement, a section of the cliff face swung inward on hidden hinges. "This way," she urged, ushering them into a narrow tunnel that had been carved into the mountain itself. "What is this place?" Isabella whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "An old mining tunnel," Victoria explained, lighting a torch she had concealed near the entrance. "The miners who worked these mountains before Steele arrived created a network of passages and emergency exits. Most people have forgotten they exist, but I've spent 3 years mapping every inch of them." The tunnel led steadily downward, branching off in multiple directions that would have been impossible to navigate without Victoria's knowledge. The walls were supported by rotting timber that creaked ominously as they passed, and more than once Charlotte had to duck to avoid low-hanging support beams. "Where does this lead?" Margaret asked, her practical mind already calculating their chances of survival. "Devil's Canyon," Victoria replied grimly. "It's the most dangerous part of these mountains. Unstable rock formations, flash flood dangers, and terrain so treacherous that even Steele's men won't follow us there willingly." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "And if we don't make it through?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Then we die free instead of dying as his playthings. I'd rather face the devil I don't know than the devil I do." The tunnel system proved to be more complex than any of them had imagined. with passages branching off in every direction and chambers that opened into vast underground caverns. Victoria moved through the maze with practiced efficiency, but Charlotte could hear something that made her blood run cold, the echo of voices and footsteps in the tunnels behind them. "They're in the tunnels," she warned Victoria, who nodded grimly. "Steele has been thorough in his preparations. He probably has maps of these passages, or at least some knowledge of their layout." Victoria's torch flickered in the damp air, casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. "We need to reach the canyon before they catch up to us." They pressed forward through increasingly treacherous terrain, climbing over rockfalls and squeezing through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways. To pass, Isabella's dress caught on jagged rocks, tearing away in strips that left a trail behind them. Margaret lost one of her shoes in a muddy section where underground water had pooled, but pressed on with grim determination. The voices behind them grew closer, and Charlotte could make out individual words now, crude jokes about what they would do to the women when they caught them, bets on which one would break first under interrogation, and worst of all, Steele's own voice giving calm, precise instructions for the capture. "He wants us alive," Charlotte realized with horror. "This isn't about preventing our escape, it's about the thrill of the hunt." They emerged from the tunnels onto a narrow ledge that overlooked Devil's Canyon, and Charlotte gasped at the sight that greeted them. The canyon was a geological nightmare, a maze of razor-sharp rock formations, unstable ledges, and crevices that seemed to drop into the very depths of the earth. Flash flood damage was evident everywhere, with massive boulders scattered like toys and the twisted remains of trees wedged into impossible positions. "Mother of God," Margaret breathed. "You expect us to cross that?" Victoria pointed to a series of narrow ledges and precarious handholds that traced a path across the canyon. "Wall, it's the only way. There's an old prospector's cabin on the other side, and from there we can reach the mining road I told you about." Isabella clutched her wooden cross and whispered rapid prayers in Spanish, but she was already preparing to follow Victoria onto the treacherous path. Charlotte admired the young woman's courage. Despite her fear, Isabella had not once suggested giving up or turning back. They had descended about halfway down the canyon wall when disaster struck. A section of the ledge that had looked solid crumbled under Margaret's weight, sending rocks cascading into the depths below. The Irish woman managed to grab onto a protruding root, but she was hanging over a drop that would certainly mean death. "Hold on," Charlotte called, reaching down to try to pull Margaret to safety. But as she stretched toward her companion, she heard the sound that confirmed her worst fears, Steele's voice echoing from the tunnel entrance above them. "My dear ladies," his cultured voice carried easily across the canyon, "I do hope you're not planning to attempt that dangerous crossing. I would hate for anything unfortunate to happen to you before we've had a chance to properly get acquainted." Marcus Steele emerged onto the ledge accompanied by 6 of his men, all armed with rifles and positioned to prevent any escape back into the tunnels. In the moonlight that had broken through the clouds, Charlotte could see that his civilized facade had finally been dropped completely. His eyes held the cold gleam of a predator who had cornered his prey, and his smile was the expression of a man who derived genuine pleasure from the suffering of others. "Victoria," he called out, his voice filled with mock concern. "My dear," scarred Victoria, "did you really think I didn't know about your little hideout in the mine shaft? Did you imagine I wasn't aware of every move you've made for the past 3 years?" Victoria's face went ashen as the implication sank in. "You've been watching me." "Watching you, following you, studying your every habit and routine," Steele confirmed with obvious satisfaction. "You've been my most successful experiment, a woman so thoroughly broken that she believed she had escaped, when in reality she was serving as the perfect bait to lure in my next group of subjects." Charlotte felt the bottom drop out of her. "World, you mean ... I mean that your rescue by Victoria was part of my plan from the beginning, Steele explained with the patience of a teacher instructing slow students. The mysterious midnight visitor, the dramatic warnings, the evidence of previous murders, all carefully orchestrated to make you believe you were uncovering hidden truths when you were actually following a script I had written. Victoria's anguished cry echoed across the canyon. No, I escaped. I survived. I've been living free for 3 years. You've been living in a cage I designed specifically for you, Steele corrected. A cage with invisible bars that allowed you to feel free while actually serving my purposes. The other women's graves you showed Charlotte? All carefully prepared props, the documents and photographs? Fabricated evidence designed to support the narrative I wanted you to believe. As the full scope of Steele's manipulation became clear, Charlotte felt a rage building inside her that overshadowed even her fear. The other women, the ones you claimed to have rescued before us, what really happened to them? Steele's smile widened. They're alive and well, living comfortable lives in various cities throughout the West. I provided them with new identities, substantial financial settlements, and opportunities to start fresh far from the dangers they had faced. They have no reason to return to this area, and every reason to forget that Steel Canyon Ranch ever existed. Isabella looked up from where she was helping Margaret climb back onto the ledge. "Pourquoi?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and betrayal. "Why this elaborate game?" "Because simple rescue is boring," Steele replied with chilling honesty. "Any man with sufficient resources can purchase women from traffickers or buy their freedom from exploitative situations. But to create an experience that tests every aspect of a woman's character, her intelligence, her courage, her capacity for trust and betrayal, that requires true artistry." He gestured toward the 4 women clinging to the canyon wall. "You have all exceeded my expectations magnificently." Charlotte's analytical mind that questioned every inconsistency, Margaret's practical courage that never wavered even in the face of certain death, Isabella's quiet faith that sustained her through unimaginable ordeals, and Victoria's determination to survive and protect others despite believing herself to be broken. You represent the finest examples of human resilience I have ever encountered. "What happens now?" Charlotte asked, though she dreaded the answer. Steele studied them with the same calculating expression she had seen him use when evaluating cattle. "Now you have a choice. You can attempt to cross Devil's Canyon, risking almost certain death on the treacherous terrain, or you can return with me to Steel Canyon Ranch, where you will live in comfort and luxury as honored guests." "Prisoners, you mean," Margaret corrected, her Irish spirit still unbroken despite their desperate situation. "Treasured companions," Steele corrected gently. "You would have every comfort, every luxury, every opportunity to pursue whatever interests or hobbies might appeal to you. The only restriction would be that you could never leave the ranch or communicate with the outside world." Victoria's scarred face twisted with bitter understanding. "Golden cages. The finest golden cages money can buy," Steele agreed. "Gilded prisons designed by someone who understands exactly what each of you needs to be happy, or at least content." Charlotte looked at her 3 companions, seeing the same resolve in their eyes that she felt burning in her own heart. "And if we refuse both options?" Steele's expression didn't change, but something cold and final entered his voice. "Then I will be forced to conclude that my experiment has failed, and failed experiments must be terminated." The 4 women exchanged glances that communicated more than words ever could. They had come too far and suffered too much to surrender their freedom now, regardless of the consequences. "Together?" Charlotte asked quietly. "Together," Margaret confirmed. "Si juntas," Isabella agreed. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. "For the first time in 3 years, together." Without another word, they turned toward the treacherous canyon crossing, and began their descent into Devil's Canyon. Behind them, Marcus Steele's voice carried one final warning across the night air. "You're making a mistake, ladies. The canyon will kill you just as surely as I would, but far less mercifully." Charlotte didn't look back as she replied, "Then we'll die as free women, not as your playthings." The last thing they heard as they disappeared into the shadows of Devil's Canyon was the sound of Steele's laughter, not the cultured chuckle of a gentleman, but the wild, unhinged laughter of a man whose carefully laid plans had been shattered by the simple power of human courage and solidarity. In the darkness below, 4 women faced the unknown perils of Devil's Canyon, united by bonds forged in deception and strengthened by the determination to claim their freedom at any cost. The most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. Devil's Canyon proved to be even more treacherous than Victoria had warned. The rock formations were like nothing Charlotte had ever seen, twisted spires of red sandstone that had been carved by centuries of flash floods into impossible shapes that defied logic and safety. The ledges they followed were barely wide enough for one person, crumbling at the edges and slick with moisture that seeped from cracks in the canyon walls. Isabella's soft-soled shoes, designed for indoor wear, provided almost no grip on the wet stone. She pressed herself against the canyon wall, her fingers bleeding from grasping at rough handholds, her prayers now whispered in desperate gasps. Margaret had torn strips from her petticoat to wrap around her remaining shoe, trying to create better traction. But the makeshift solution was already failing. Victoria led them deeper into the maze with the confidence of someone who had studied every possible escape route, but Charlotte could see the strain in her movements. The psychological revelation of Steele's manipulation had shaken her more than the physical dangers they faced. Everything she had believed about her survival, her freedom, her purpose in helping others, all of it had been an illusion crafted by a master manipulator. "There," Victoria pointed to a narrow chimney in the rock face that seemed to lead upward. "We can climb up through there and reach the middle tier of the canyon. From there, it's only about half a mile to the old prospector's cabin." Charlotte looked up at the vertical shaft, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, with handholds that were little more than cracks in the stone. "Are you certain this is the only way?" "The only way Steele's men won't follow," Victoria confirmed. "They're skilled trackers and gunfighters, but they're not mountaineers. This kind of climbing requires techniques that most frontier men never learn." The chimney climb proved to be a test of endurance that pushed all 4 women to their absolute limits. They had to brace themselves between the opposing walls, using their backs against one side and their feet against the other, inching upward a few feet at a time. The rock was sharp enough to cut through fabric and skin, and more than once someone's grip slipped, sending them sliding back down several feet of hard-won progress. Isabella was the first to reach her breaking point. Halfway up the 60-foot chimney, her strength gave out completely. She hung suspended between the walls, unable to move up or down, tears streaming down her face as she whispered what sounded like final prayers. "I cannot do this," she gasped in English, her accent thick with exhaustion and despair. "I am not strong enough. Leave me here and save yourselves." Margaret, climbing directly below her, looked up with fierce determination. "Like hell we're leaving you behind, girl. We started this together, and we'll finish it together." The Irish woman braced herself securely and reached up to support Isabella's feet, giving her the leverage she needed to continue climbing. Charlotte and Victoria followed their example, creating a human chain that allowed them to support each other. Through the most difficult sections of the ascent, they emerged from the chimney onto a narrow ledge just as the first drops of rain began to fall. In the desert climate of Montana Territory, rain was often a blessing, but in Devil's Canyon, it was a death sentence. The rock formations that looked merely dangerous in dry conditions became absolutely lethal when wet, and the narrow passages could become raging torrents in a matter of minutes. "We need to find shelter immediately," Victoria warned, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Flash floods in this canyon can reach heights of 30 feet or more, and they come without warning." But as they searched desperately for any kind of protection from the approaching storm, they discovered they were not alone on the canyon floor. A figure emerged from behind a massive boulder, one of Steele's men, armed with a rifle and blocking their path to the prospectors' cabin. "Well, well," the man drawled, his weathered face split by a cruel grin. "Looks like the boss was right about where you'd try to go. Name's Jake Corbin, and I'm here to bring you ladies back to the ranch where you belong." Charlotte recognized him as one of the men who had been at the Saloon auction, one of Ezra Colt's associates who had somehow survived the federal raid and found employment with Steele. His eyes held the same predatory gleam she had seen in too many men during her ordeal. "You're making a mistake, Corbin," Victoria said, trying to buy time as the rain intensified. "Steele may have sent you, but he didn't tell you about the flash flood danger. If you don't get to higher ground immediately, you'll drown along with us." Corbin laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Nice try, lady, but I wasn't born yesterday. Besides, a little rain never hurt nobody." As if summoned by his words, a low rumble echoed through the canyon, not thunder, but something far more ominous. The sound of water rushing through the narrow passages higher up in the canyon system, growing stronger by the second. Victoria's face went white with terror. "Everyone climb. Now, get as high as you can." The four women scrambled up the nearest rock formation, their exhausted muscles screaming in protest as they sought any handhold that would lift them above the canyon floor. Corbin finally seemed to understand the danger, but his realization came too late. The wall of water that roared around the bend was a brown torrent filled with debris, tree branches, boulders, and the twisted remains of anything that had been caught in its path upstream. It was 12 feet high and moving with the speed of a runaway locomotive, turning the narrow canyon into a death trap for anything caught at ground level. Corbin's scream was cut short as the flood swept him away, his rifle disappearing into the churning water, along with any chance of using it against his intended captives. The women pressed themselves against the rock face as the water rose to within inches of their precarious perches, praying that the flood would recede before their strength gave out completely. For 20 terrifying minutes, Devil's Canyon became exactly what its name suggested, a vision of hell on earth. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, drowning out even their own thoughts, as they clung to the rock face with fingertips that had long since gone numb from cold and strain. As they waited for the flood to subside, huddled together on a ledge barely wide enough for the four of them, Victoria made a confession that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. "I lied to you about the other women," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the water below. "Not about Steele's manipulation, that was all true. But about what happened to them." Charlotte felt her heart sink. "What do you mean?" "Some of them did disappear," Victoria continued, her scarred face twisted with guilt and self-recrimination. "But not all of them were murdered. Some of them chose to stay at the ranch, even after they learned the truth about Steele's gains. They chose comfort and security over freedom and uncertainty." Margaret's eyes blazed with anger. "You mean they became willing prisoners?" "They became pragmatists," Victoria replied bitterly. "When faced with the choice between a gilded cage and an uncertain future in a hostile world, they chose the cage. They convinced themselves that being Steele's pampered captives was better than being free women struggling to survive on the frontier." Isabella looked up from her prayers, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond her years. "And you could not forgive them for that choice?" Victoria nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I despised their weakness, their willingness to trade dignity for comfort. So I created the story about the murders to make them seem like martyrs instead of collaborators. I thought it would make their sacrifice seem more noble, more worthy of remembrance. But now I understand, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger despite the howling wind. Steele's real genius wasn't in creating elaborate death traps or psychological torture chambers. It was in offering people exactly what they thought they wanted most: safety, comfort, belonging, and then making them complicit in their own captivity. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The women who stayed, they help him with the new arrivals, don't they? They're part of the process now. They help make his lies believable, Victoria confirmed. They testify to his kindness, his generosity, his genuine desire to help women in distress. They become living proof that his rescue operations are legitimate, that his ranch is truly a sanctuary for the desperate and displaced. The water level began to recede, revealing a canyon floor scoured clean by the flood. Corbin's body was nowhere to be seen, swept away to wherever the torrent eventually deposited its deadly cargo. But the immediate danger had passed, leaving the four women alone with the terrible knowledge of what awaited them if they returned to Steel Canyon Ranch. "We could still go back," Margaret said quietly, her practical nature forcing her to voice the option none of them wanted to consider. "We could accept Steele's offer, live in comfort and safety, never have to worry about survival again." Isabella looked at her with eyes that held depths of understanding forged in suffering. "And become part of his collection. Help him deceive the next group of women who think they are being rescued. Is that so wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Is it wrong to choose life over principle, survival over heroism?" Charlotte studied her companions' faces, seeing the same internal struggle reflected in each of them. They were all strong women who had endured more than most people could imagine, but they were also human beings with very human desires for safety, comfort, and belonging. "I don't know if it's wrong," Charlotte said finally, "but I know it's not who I am. I'd rather die as myself than live as someone else's version of who I should be." Victoria smiled for the first time since the terrible revelation of Steele's manipulation. "Then we're in agreement. We finish what we started, no matter the cost." The climb out of Devil's Canyon proved to be even more challenging than their descent, complicated by the lingering effects of the flash flood and their own exhaustion. The rock faces were now slick with moisture, and many of their previous handholds had been washed away or weakened by the torrent of water. But something had changed in the group dynamic during their ordeal in the storm. The shared knowledge of what awaited them if they failed, combined with their conscious choice to continue despite the option of comfortable surrender, had forged them into something more than four individual women seeking escape. They had become a unit, bound together by shared purpose and mutual commitment to each other's freedom. When Isabella's strength failed on a particularly difficult section, Margaret was there to support her. When Charlotte's injured hands could no longer grip the sharp rock, Victoria guided her to easier holds. When Victoria's psychological wounds threatened to overwhelm her with despair, Isabella's quiet faith and Charlotte's determined optimism pulled her back from the edge. They reached the rim of Devil's Canyon as the first light of dawn broke over the Montana mountains, revealing a landscape transformed by the night's storm. The old prospector's cabin Victoria had promised stood about a quarter-mile away, looking like the most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. But even as they stumbled toward the promise of shelter and safety, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest test was yet to come. Marcus Steele was not a man who accepted defeat easily, and his resources extended far beyond the boundaries of Steel Canyon Ranch. The game was far from over, and the next move would determine whether they would finally achieve the freedom they had sacrificed so much to claim, or whether they would discover that even in the vast wilderness of the frontier, there was no escape from a predator with unlimited patience and resources. The cabin awaited them. But so did the unknown dangers of a world where Marcus Steele's influence might reach farther than any of them dared to imagine. The prospector's cabin sat perched on a windswept plateau like a monument to human stubbornness, its weathered logs and patched roof testament to someone's determination to carve out a life in the wilderness. But as the four women approached the structure, Charlotte noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and fresh horses were tethered behind the building. "Someone's here," she whispered, grabbing Victoria's arm. This was supposed to be abandoned. Victoria's scarred face went pale as the implications hit her. "It's another trap. Steele knew we'd come here. He's been planning this from the beginning." The cabin door opened before they could retreat, and a figure emerged that none of them had expected to see. It was Eleanor Hartwell, Steele's elegant ranch manager, but she was dressed in practical traveling clothes and carried a Winchester rifle with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. "Ladies," Eleanor said, her cultured voice carrying easily across the morning air, "please come inside. We need to talk." Margaret stepped protectively in front of Isabella, her Irish temper flaring. "Talk about what? How you've been helping that monster manipulate innocent women." Eleanor's expression was unreadable. "About how you can actually escape Marcus Steele permanently. About why I've been waiting here for 3 hours, hoping you'd survive the canyon crossing." Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and supplies were laid out on a rough wooden table: food, clean clothes, medical supplies, and, most importantly, legal documents that bore official seals. Eleanor poured coffee from a pot warming by the fire, her movements precise and economical. "I know what you're thinking," she said without preamble. "You believe I'm part of Steele's organization, complicit in his psychological games. You're partially correct. I have been working for him for 5 years, but not for the reasons you imagine." Charlotte remained standing, ready to run if necessary. "Then enlighten us." Eleanor set down her coffee cup and met each woman's eyes in turn. "My real name is Eleanor Hartwell Morrison. I'm a federal investigator assigned to infiltrate Steele's operation and gather evidence of his crimes. The problem is that Marcus Steele is far more clever than anyone in Washington realized." She gestured toward the documents on the table. "Everything he does is technically legal. The women he rescues sign contracts voluntarily. The ones who stay at the ranch do so by choice. The ones who leave receive generous settlements and new identities. On paper, he's a philanthropist who helps displaced women start new lives." Victoria's voice was bitter with disbelief. "And the psychological manipulation? The elaborate games?" "Unethical, immoral, and despicable," Eleanor replied. "But not illegal. Marcus Steele has found a way to satisfy his need for control and dominance while staying just inside the boundaries of the law. He's a predator who has learned to hunt in broad daylight." Eleanor spread out the documents, revealing a complex legal strategy that had been years in the making. "However, there is one crime he has committed that we can prove: conspiracy to interfere with federal investigations. 3 of the women he rescued over the past 2 years were actually federal agents planted to gather evidence against him." Charlotte felt her heart race. What happened to them? They disappeared completely. Not relocated with new identities like the others, not living comfortably at the ranch. They simply vanished. That's murder, and murder is very much illegal. Even in Montana territory. Eleanor's expression hardened. "The problem is that we need witnesses. We need someone who has seen the operation from the inside, who can testify to the systematic nature of his crimes. Someone who chose to escape rather than accept his offer of comfortable captivity." The implications were staggering. Victoria looked stunned. "You're saying we were never really in danger? That this was all some kind of federal operation?" "You were in very real danger," Eleanor corrected. "The psychological manipulation was genuine. The threats were real. And if you had chosen to stay at the ranch, you would have disappeared just as surely as the others. The only difference is that we've been watching, waiting for someone strong enough to escape and brave enough to testify." Margaret's practical nature cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Eleanor pulled out a telegram bearing official federal seals. "In 3 days, a federal judge will arrive in Helena to hear testimony in the case against Marcus Steele. If you're willing to testify about what you've experienced, we have enough evidence to arrest him on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder." Isabella spoke up for the first time since entering the cabin. "And if we refuse? Then you're free to go wherever you choose, with federal protection and enough money to start new lives anywhere you want," Eleanor replied. "But Marcus Steele will continue his operations, and other women will face the same ordeals you've endured." Charlotte studied the federal documents, her educated mind parsing the legal language and understanding the magnitude of what was being asked. Testifying against him means revealing our identities publicly. It means living with the knowledge that his associates might seek revenge. It means giving up any chance of truly disappearing and starting over. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Justice always comes with a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it." The 4 women sat in silence around the cabin's rough table, each wrestling with the choice between personal safety and public responsibility. Outside, the Montana wind howled across the plateau, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the isolation they would face regardless of their decision. Victoria spoke first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "For 3 years, I've lived with the guilt of believing I was the only survivor. If there's a chance to stop him from destroying other lives, I have to take it." Margaret nodded slowly. "I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. In Ireland, we learned that silence in the face of oppression is just another form of collaboration." Isabella clutched her wooden cross, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of the decision. "In my village we have a saying, El silencio alimenta al diablo. Silence feeds the devil. I will not feed the devil with my silence." All eyes turned to Charlotte, who had emerged as their unofficial leader during the ordeal. She thought of all the women who might follow in their footsteps, all the desperate souls who might mistake Steele's manipulation for genuine rescue. "We testify," she said simply. "We face whatever comes next, and we make sure Marcus Steele never has the chance to play his games again." 3 weeks later, Marcus Steele was led away from the Helena courthouse in chains, convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The trial had been a sensation, with newspaper reporters from across the country covering the story of the Montana Predator and the 4 brave women who brought him to justice. The other women at Steele Canyon Ranch, those who had chosen comfortable captivity over uncertain freedom, were given new opportunities to make genuine choices about their futures, with federal support and protection. Some chose to stay together, forming a cooperative that transformed the ranch into a legitimate sanctuary for women escaping dangerous situations. Others dispersed across the country, finally free to make decisions based on their own desires rather than fear and manipulation. Charlotte accepted a position with the federal government, helping to develop new protocols for investigating human trafficking operations. Margaret returned to Chicago, where she established a school for immigrant children, funded by the federal reward money she had received for her testimony. Isabella traveled to California, where she joined a convent and dedicated her life to helping other displaced women find safety and purpose. Victoria chose a different path. She remained in Montana Territory, working with Eleanor Hartwell to continue the fight against human trafficking operations throughout the frontier. Her scars had become symbols of survival rather than shame, and her story inspired other victims to come forward and seek justice. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the American West from a lawless frontier to a place where justice could prevail, they often cited the Thunder Creek case as a turning point. 4 women who had been treated as property, who had been manipulated and hunted and terrorized, had chosen to stand up and demand accountability from a system that had failed them. Their courage had ripple effects that extended far beyond them. Conviction of one man. New laws were passed protecting women from trafficking and exploitation. Federal agencies developed better strategies for investigating sophisticated criminal operations. Most importantly, the story of their survival and triumph gave hope to countless other victims who had believed they were powerless against their oppressors. The Devil's Bargain Saloon in Thunder Creek was eventually torn down, replaced by a school that bore a simple plaque: in honor of those who choose freedom over comfort, justice over safety, and courage over silence. Out here in the frontier wilderness, not every story ends with shootouts at high noon or riders disappearing into the sunset. Sometimes the greatest victories are won in courtrooms and classrooms, by ordinary people who refuse to let extraordinary evil go unchallenged. The four women who walked away from Steel Canyon Ranch that dawn had learned that true freedom isn't something that can be given or taken away. It's something that must be claimed, defended, and shared with others who need the courage to claim it for themselves.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.